During the late 1930s, as military aviation was moving from biplane fighters to monoplane fighters, Grumman used their F4F naval biplane as the basis of a new biplane design, the XF4F. But it quickly became obvious that their next fighter needed to be a monoplane, so the XF4F was reworked into the XF4F2 to compete head-to-head against the Brewster Buffalo. Grumman actually lost the production contract, but rather than give up, they went back to the drawing board and worked out the XF4F3. It had new wings, some structural improvements, and importantly, a new supercharged engine. The new plane was ordered into production as the F4F3 and entered service with the US Navy at the end of 1940. Over in Europe, both France and the UK were interested too, and the Royal Navy actually started operating the plane before the US Navy. The plane was called the Martlet in UK service, and it was already flying in combat over the Atlantic before the US Navy took delivery of their first airframe. Early in the Pacific War, the US Navy struggled a bit against the Japanese A6M0, and the F4F suffered heavy losses. But as 1942 continued, US pilots developed new tactics and learned to use the Wildcat's strengths against the Japanese plane's weaknesses. Over the course of the war, the Wildcat eventually redeemed itself and developed a positive win-to-loss ratio against Japanese fighters, mostly thanks to superior tactics and just US pilots gaining practical experience in combat. The plane was also famously tough and able to absorb enormous amounts of hits from the chronically undergunned Japanese fighters it usually faced, with many US pilots owing their lives to the sturdy little plane. The F4F played a critical role during the Battle of Midway, and in 1943 production shifted from Grumman to General Motors under the designations FM1 and FM2, with the Wildcat by that point being mostly transitioned to service aboard smaller escort carriers. By the end of the war, almost 8,000 Wildcats were built, and lessons learned from the F4F led directly to the highly successful F6F and later the F8F. What we get in Warthunder are three versions of the Wildcat, the F4F3 and the F4F4 in the American tech tree, along with the Martlet as an event vehicle for the UK air tree. The primary differences are the set of weapons, which you can see on the chart here, along with some very minor differences in flight performance. In this review, I'm focusing on the F4F4, but about 95% of it applies to the other Wildcats as well. For armaments, the Wildcat relies on either 4 or 6 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, depending on version. You get the usual American selection of ammo belts, and for air targets, my preference is usually the Tracer's or Universal belt. It is worth noting though that regardless of which belt you take, these guns don't have a lot of firepower on their own, and even at this low BR, you might need a good deal of time on target to bring down enemy planes depending on what you're shooting at. For loadouts, the American Wildcats get a pair of light bombs, which don't end up being very useful. The flight performance of the F4F is gonna take some getting used to. The plane's performance is mostly skewed in favor of high altitude flying, mostly thanks to the supercharged engine, but the problem is that in Warthunder's game modes, you almost never get to actually engage in combat up at 5,000 meters or so with this plane. Its rate of climb is just too poor to get up there in a reasonable amount of time in a Warthunder match. This means that the majority of your experience will be down at lower altitudes, where most of the planes the F4F goes up against are going to have significant advantages. The acceleration and maximum speed are both unimpressive, and the Wildcat is just one of those planes that feels kinda slow. The plane does roll well, and its overall combat agility is generally average through 2 or 3 maneuvers or so, but the energy retention isn't good, and once it runs out of speed, it just doesn't have the engine power to get it back very quickly. It's easy to get energy trapped, and you should avoid vertical maneuvers whenever possible. The good news is that the plane is incredibly tough in Warthunder, just like it was out in real life. because you didn't skip over the intro section of the video, right? And it can usually take an enormous amount of punishment from enemy fighters before this thing goes down. Also, it dives very well, and it'll hit an aerodynamic red line before any structural problems or control compression really become much of an issue, but you should still watch your throttle on the way down just in case. You get access to full manual engine controls with the Wildcat, so you can tweak it a bit for better cooling if you use the manual engine settings. Taking the F4F out into air battles is challenging, but it's a fun challenge and not a frustrating rage quit disaster or anything. You don't have very good climb performance, so in realistic battles, you'll generally be limited to lower medium level air combat. Try to stay near your team and avoid one-on-one turn fights against more agile planes like Spitfires or I-16s. I personally have much better luck in the Wildcat, flying out and trying to cover my teammates, than I would just going in for individual dogfights. But if you can get this thing up to altitude, it does very well at boom and zoom vulture tactics, and it can actually outturn a lot of planes up at high altitude thanks to holding its energy better in sustained turns up at those levels. In arcade battles, it's mostly the same story, but the air spawn lets you climb up a bit more often, and while most enemy planes can still outclimb you, you'll get to position for high altitude attacks more frequently than in RB. Plus, the buffs to the flight model, along with this plane's already great durability, mean that it does much better in huge furballs than it will out in RB. Regardless of which mode you fly though, just remember that the guns sometimes do need a lot of time on target to get kills, especially if your aim with the M2 Brownings isn't exactly S tier, and to be clear, mine definitely isn't. In terms of ground attack, you get 2 very small bombs far out on the wings, which is basically the worst place for them. Loading them up hurts your flight performance, and their position kind of makes accurate drops pretty difficult. It's possible to attack 1 or 2 ground targets per spawn, but generally I don't suggest this plane for ground pounding or close air support. Visually, this is a fun-looking little plane that has a distinctive teardrop shape that very obviously comes out of the late 1930s. It's got that really distinct Grumman lineage. You can unlock a few extra paint jobs for it, and overall, I think this is a nice plane to look at. And honestly, more than with a lot of other planes, it reminds me of its history and stuff anytime I see it, which, for me anyway, makes it a lot more fun to fly out in the game. Landing the F4F can be tricky, as the landing gear is hand-cranked and it deploys very slowly, so you've got to set it out well in advance. You can drop the gear a little over 300 kilometers an hour, and the good news is that on normal runway landings, you can also just lock up the brakes since the plane isn't going to nose over. Oh, and it can do carrier stuff. The cockpit is kinda lackluster. The visibility is poor, and the drawn-on instruments are a throwback to the early days of Warthunder, but the gun sight is actually pretty easy to use in VR, but otherwise I really didn't care for this cockpit. To close out on the F4F. This plane is incredibly tough. It has good high altitude performance, and it can do carrier stuff. However, it's not great in most one-on-one dogfights, its flight performance suffers a bit at lower levels, and it has very limited potential for any kind of ground attack. The final verdict on the Grumman F4F Wildcat is that this plane can still be fun to fly despite not always playing very well in Warthunder's current game modes, and as long as you know what to expect from it, you probably won't be let down. As always, thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, check out this other one.